Oh, hi there. Welcome to TAS Film and TV Reviews. So this is my review of A House of Dynamite, which was released recently in selected cinemas and also on Netflix. So in this review, I'm going to be talking about my reflections of the movie, which will include sort of loose plot spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film yet, then maybe go and watch it and come back here when you've done that. The film itself is directed by Kathryn Bigelow, previous director of films such as The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30 and Point Break. And she was also the first woman to win the Best Director Oscar for The Hurt Locker. So going into this, you sort of know that you're going to be in very good hands with her. So the general premise of A House of Dynamite is that an unknown actor, most likely a nation state, has launched a nuclear strike on the US. And the film unfolds as we watch the political and military response to this, and we see the drama unfold through different people's eyes over 3 different acts. And in each case, there's some overlap of the timeline, but we move forward in each act slightly towards the dramatic conclusion. And by taking that approach, Bigelow, she really ramps up the tension and suspense, and we see how different individuals and agencies respond to the crisis in different ways. So we see people's personal and professional responses and how they overlap, and we watch in real time as sort of people's assumptions and hopes just crumble. So in terms of the cast, we've got Idris Elba as the unnamed US president, we've got Rebecca Ferguson as Captain Olivia Walker, Gabriel Basso as Deputy National Security Advisor Jake Barrington, Jared Harris as Secretary of Defense Reid Baker, and Tracy Letts as General Anthony Brady. And of course, as you'd expect from a Kathryn Bigelow film, it's technically excellent. The screenplay, the cinematography, the score, it all just really ramps up the tension and helps to gradually build towards a crescendo in the final act. And I also really enjoyed the performances. I thought Jared Harris, Idris Elba and Rebecca Ferguson especially were excellent. And through their performances, we really got their sense of sort of escalating panic and loss of control, and it was visceral on the screen. And the supporting cast, likewise, were all good. There's a particularly gripping bit in the film as we watch a missile defence team in Alaska try to respond to this crisis. And all the actors in that bit of the film did an absolutely great job. And then in terms of content, watching this, I was sort of reminded of the 2005 drama based on the Kennedy White House response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days. And that is definitely not a bad thing. And tonally and by way of content, there's a number of similarities between the two films. And making the comparison between this fictional White House and then the Kennedy White House in 1962, I got the impression through Bigelow's storytelling that the political and military response to this nuclear threat in A House of Dynamite was sort of quite muddled and, perhaps even unserious in many ways. And that got me thinking a little bit more widely about the world order as it exists in 2025 and what Kathryn Bigelow is perhaps trying to communicate to us through this movie. And one of the key points of interest in this film, well for me at least, was that Idris Elba's president, he seemed to be uniquely unqualified to manage the situation that's in front of him. We've got this missile hurtling towards US soil, and at one point he starts talking about a podcast he'd listened to in which they talk about this House of Dynamite. In another scene, he asks the young soldier who's assigned to him, who carries the nuclear codes around in a briefcase, for his views on what to do. And in another scene, we see him consulting his wife on the best course of action. And then I contrasted that with, Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as depicted in 13 Days. And, the level of preparedness, the Kennedy administration sort of creativity, their capacity to think clearly in difficult circumstances, even the ideology behind their actions, their belief in something. And that all jumped off the screen in the same way as Elba's president's unpreparedness did in this movie. And according to his brother, JFK had read a book called The Guns of August in the summer of 1961, so just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that book explored the early months and strategic missteps of the various military and political figures in World War I, and how assumptions based on earlier wars ended with millions dead. And we got that understanding that Kennedy and the people around him were, well read, they were serious thinkers. And thinking about that in the context of Idris Elba's president's response to this crisis in 2025, I wonder if Bigelow isn't making a sort of subtle critique of the liberal world order as it exists now, and of our political class more generally, perhaps emphasising the lack of seriousness or heft of our modern leaders. Think about the average politician in 2025. Do they really believe in anything beyond their own ability to do the job? Do they have an overarching political philosophy beyond self-advancement? Do they have an ideology that helps them make sense of the world? Liberalism is a dirty word now, but in the 60s, at least they thought they knew what they were fighting for. They were standing up for a rules-based international order, for democracy as compared to communism. And in that context, people like the Kennedys, they were substantial political figures, whether we agree with their assumptions now or not. And they also had knowledgeable and authoritative figures around them. Kennedy had his brother, he had Robert McNamara, he had trusted advisors. But as I touched on, in A House of Dynamite, Idris Elba's character was talking to his wife and to a young soldier who follows him around with a briefcase with, the different scenarios laid out, colour-coded. That guy was probably 15 or 20 years his junior. And at one point at the climax of the movie, Idris Elba's president, he's asking this guy for advice. So I think perhaps through this movie, Bigelow is making a sort of subtle and effective critique of the Western political establishment and of our politics more widely in 2025. And I really think, because of the subject matter, what she's saying here should terrify us all. Because, we must be at 2 minutes to 12 on the doomsday clock now. And how prepared are our leaders to deal with situations like this? So overall, I really enjoyed the film. I thought it was extremely effective. It was tightly told with interesting different perspectives on the same timeline. And it built suspense nicely over the 3 acts, culminating in Idris Elba's president's quandary here. And as I've alluded to, it really asked a lot of uncomfortable questions. And the main one of which is that if the analysis I set out earlier is correct, and our leaders are basically useless and lack any sort of historical framework for making difficult geopolitical decisions, how far away are we really from total annihilation? So yeah, I really enjoyed this film. Definitely one of the best movies I've seen on streaming services for quite some time. So yeah, I'd highly recommend it. Of course, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.